In the flickering candlelight of her small room, Elena trembled as she heard James's footsteps approaching. She had been avoiding him for 3 days, terrified that her silence about his proposal had already cost her the only man who'd ever seen her as more than just a housekeeper. When he gently slipped the delicate white glove onto her weathered hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles instead of demanding an answer, she realized that sometimes love speaks louder in gestures than in words. But would this single moment of tenderness be enough to bridge the impossible divide between a Mexican servant and a rancher's son in 1867 Wyoming? The rooster's sharp cry cut through the morning air like a knife, but Elena Vasquez was already awake, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor of her tiny room behind the kitchen. Something felt different about this Tuesday morning. In July 1867, the air seemed thicker, charged with the kind of energy that came before thunderstorms in the Wyoming territory. She dressed quickly in her worn brown dress, the same one she had mended 3 times this month. Her fingers worked automatically, braiding her long black hair, while her mind wandered to the strange dream that had woken her before dawn. In it, she had been wearing a beautiful white dress, dancing in a grand ballroom filled with people who smiled at her instead of looking through her like she was invisible. The dream made her stomach twist with longing and shame in equal measure. Elena pushed open the back door of the Caldwell ranch house and stepped into the pale morning light. The mountains that surrounded their valley stood like silent guardians, their peaks still touched with snow even in summer. She had lived here for 5 years now, but the beauty of this place still took her breath away sometimes. The milk cow, Bessie, waited in the barn with obvious impatience, her udder full and heavy. Elena grabbed the wooden pail from its hook and walked across the yard, her skirts swishing through the dew-wet grass. The familiar routine of morning chores usually calmed her racing thoughts, but today her hands shook slightly as she unlatched the barn door. Inside, the air was warm and sweet with the smell of hay and animals. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the wooden walls, creating golden stripes across the packed dirt floor. Elena settled onto the 3-legged stool beside Bessie and began to milk, the steady rhythm usually as soothing as a lullaby. But today, every sound made her jump. The creak of settling wood, the rustle of mice in the hayloft, the distant sound of someone chopping wood near the main house. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, though she couldn't say exactly why. 3 days. It had been 3 days since James Caldwell had cornered her by the old cottonwood tree that grew beside the creek. 3 days since he had said words that still echoed in her mind, making her cheeks burn with memory. Elena, I need to tell you something. I've been watching you, thinking about you, and I can't keep it to myself anymore. She had known what was coming before he said it, had seen it building in his glances across the dinner table, in the way he found excuses to be wherever she was working, in how his voice changed when he spoke her name. I love you. 2 simple words that had turned her world upside down. Elena pressed her forehead against Bessie's warm flank and tried to push the memory away. James Caldwell was the eldest son of the family she worked for. Someday, he would inherit this ranch, these thousands of acres of grassland and cattle. He was tall and strong, with kind brown eyes and hands that could gentle the wildest horse. And she was nobody, a Mexican girl whose family had sent her north to work because there wasn't enough food at home. She cleaned floors and washed dishes and mended clothes, grateful for a roof over her head and enough to eat. The invisible line between them might as well have been a canyon. The sound of boots on gravel froze her hands mid-squeeze. Bessie snorted and shifted, sensing Elena's sudden tension. Those weren't just any boots, she knew that particular stride. The confident way James moved across the yard like he owned not just the land, but the very air above it. Elena squeezed her eyes shut and prayed he would walk past the barn. Please, she thought desperately, please just let me finish my work in peace. But the footsteps stopped right outside the barn door. Her breath caught in her throat as his shadow fell across the doorway, blocking some of the morning light. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Elena could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears, could smell the familiar scent of leather and sage that always seemed to cling to his clothes. Elena. His voice was soft, careful, like he was trying not to spook a frightened animal. She didn't answer, couldn't trust her voice not to shake. Instead, she focused on milking Bessie, trying to pretend that her whole world hadn't just tilted sideways. James stepped into the barn, and Elena felt, rather than saw him settle against the wall nearby. Close enough that she was aware of his presence, like heat from a fire, but far enough away that he wasn't crowding her. He had always been thoughtful that way, even as a boy when she had first come to work for his family. "You've been avoiding me," he said quietly. Elena's hand stilled on the cow's udder. She had been avoiding him, ducking around corners when she heard his voice, taking the long way to the vegetable garden to stay away from the pastures where he worked with the horses. She had even asked Mrs. Caldwell if she could eat her meals in the kitchen instead of serving at the family table. "I've been busy," she whispered, hating how weak her voice sounded. "With what?" The question hung in the air between them. Elena couldn't think of a single task that would explain why she had barely spoken to him since that evening by the creek. The truth was, she was terrified. Terrified of the way her heart raced when he looked at her. Terrified of the impossible dreams that had started growing in the quiet corners of her mind. Most of all, terrified that if she let herself believe, even for a moment, that someone like James Caldwell could really love someone like her, the disappointment would destroy her. "Elena, look at me, please." The gentleness in his voice almost broke her resolve. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned her head to meet his gaze. James was standing with the morning sun behind him, making his dark hair shine with gold highlights. His work shirt was already dusty from the morning chores, and there was a small cut on his chin where he must have nicked himself shaving. He looked tired, she realized, like he hadn't been sleeping well. "I meant what I said the other night," he told her, his brown eyes serious and steady. "I know it probably seems impossible to you. I know there are 100 reasons why you think it can't work between us, but I need you to know that I meant every word." Elena's throat felt tight, like someone was squeezing it closed. Part of her wanted to run from the barn, to escape this conversation, and the feelings it stirred up. But another part of her, a part she tried to keep buried deep, wanted to hear more. "Mr. Caldwell," she began. "James," he corrected gently. "Just James. Like it's always been when we're alone together." He was right. When it was just the two of them, away from his parents and the other ranch hands, the formal walls came down. They had talked about books during the long winter evenings, when she mended clothes by the fire, and he worked on the ranch accounts. They had laughed together over shared jokes, argued good-naturedly about whether the spotted calf would grow up to be the biggest steer on the ranch. Somewhere along the way, without her quite realizing it, they had become friends. And now he wanted more. Bessie stamped her foot impatiently, reminding Elena that she had stopped milking. She turned back to her work, grateful for something to do with her hands. "My family came here with nothing," she said quietly, not looking at him. "My father worked in the silver mines until his lungs gave out. My mother took in washing until her hands cracked and bled from the lye soap. They sent me here because there were too many mouths to feed at home." "I know," James said softly. "I sleep in a room the size of a closet. I own 2 dresses and 1 pair of shoes. I can barely read, and my English." She gestured helplessly, frustrated by the words she couldn't find. "Your English is beautiful," James said firmly, "and you're one of the smartest people I know. Remember when you figured out why the hens had stopped laying eggs? Or when you taught me how to make that salve for rope burns?" Elena felt tears prick her eyes. He was being kind, but kindness wouldn't change the facts of who they were and where they came from. "Your parents," she whispered. "What would they say?" James was quiet for a long moment. When Elena risked a glance at him, his jaw was set in the stubborn line she had seen when he was determined to break a particularly difficult horse. "My parents want me to be happy," he said finally. "And you make me happy, Elena. Happier than I've ever been in my life." The milk pail was nearly full now, white foam rising to the rim. Elena's hands moved automatically, but her mind was spinning. She thought of Mrs. Caldwell, always proper and correct, who treated Elena with distant politeness but never unkindness. She thought of Mr. Caldwell, gruff and practical, who cared more about a person's work ethic than their pedigree. Would they really accept a Mexican housekeeper as a daughter-in-law? I don't know what to say, Elena admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Then don't say anything yet, James replied. Just think about it. Think about what we could have together. He pushed away from the wall, and Elena felt a flutter of panic. Was he leaving? Was this conversation over? But instead of walking away, James moved closer, settling onto a bale of hay nearby. Close enough now that Elena could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count the freckles across his nose that had darkened from hours in the sun. Tell me about your dream, he said unexpectedly. Elena's hand stilled again. What dream? You were talking in your sleep this morning. I heard you through the kitchen window when I came in for coffee. James's expression was gentle, curious. You sounded happy. Heat rushed to Elena's cheeks. She had been talking in her sleep. What had she said? The dream of the white dress and the ballroom seemed foolish now, childish. It was nothing, she mumbled. Didn't sound like nothing. Elena finished milking Bessie and stood, her legs unsteady. The full pail was heavy in her hands, and she used it as an excuse to move away from James, to put some distance between them. I should get this to the kitchen, she said. Mrs. Caldwell will be wanting her morning coffee soon. Elena. James stood too, blocking her path to the door. Not threatening, just present. Unavoidable. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But running away won't make these feelings disappear. She looked up at him then, really looked at him. James Caldwell, who could have his pick of any girl in the territory. The banker's daughter in town, with her fancy dresses and piano lessons. The preacher's niece, who quoted scripture and never had a hair out of place. Any number of suitable young women who would fit seamlessly into his world. Instead, he was here in the barn at dawn, trying to convince a frightened housekeeper to trust him with her heart. Why me? The question slipped out before she could stop it. James smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him in 3 days. It transformed his whole face, made him look younger, happier. Because when you laugh, it sounds like music. Because you're kind to every creature on this ranch, from the barn cats to the oldest cow. Because you see beauty in things other people overlook. Because when you're concentrating on mending or cooking, you get this little crease between your eyebrows that makes me want to kiss it away. Elena's breath caught. No one had ever talked about her like that before. Like she was precious. Like she mattered. Because, James continued, his voice dropping lower, when I think about spending the rest of my life without you, I can't breathe. The milk pail slipped from Elena's nerveless fingers, hitting the dirt floor with a dull thud. White milk spread across the packed earth, and she stared at it in horror. Oh no, she gasped, dropping to her knees to try to salvage what she could. Mrs. Caldwell will be so angry. That was all the milk for today. And now, Elena. James knelt beside her, his hands covering hers to still their frantic movement. It's all right. We have other cows. It's just milk. But it wasn't just milk to Elena. It was one more thing she had done wrong, one more way she had failed at the simple tasks expected of her. Tears blurred her vision as she looked at the spreading puddle. Hey, James's voice was infinitely gentle. He reached out and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. It's all right. I'll milk another cow. No one will ever know. Elena looked up at him. This man who was willing to do her chores to save her from embarrassment, who spoke to her like she was worth something precious. For just a moment, she let herself imagine what it would be like to wake up every morning knowing she was loved, to have someone who put her happiness above his own comfort. The dream seemed less impossible when she looked into James's eyes. But then reality crashed back down. She pulled away from his touch and scrambled to her feet, smoothing her skirts with shaking hands. I have to go, she said quickly. The coffee, the breakfast. Elena, wait. But she was already moving, practically running from the barn and the dangerous hope that James's words had kindled in her chest. Behind her, she heard him sigh, heard the sound of him moving to clean up the spilled milk. Her heart was pounding as she reached the kitchen door, and she pressed her back against it for a moment, trying to catch her breath. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Caldwell moving around the dining room, setting the table for breakfast. Elena closed her eyes and tried to push James's words from her mind, but they clung to her like cobwebs, following her as she went about her morning tasks. When I think about spending the rest of my life without you, I can't breathe. How is she supposed to forget words like that? The kitchen of the Caldwell house smelled like fresh biscuits and bacon grease as Elena worked to prepare the morning meal. Her hands moved through the familiar motion, slicing ham, stirring gravy, checking the biscuits in the oven, but her mind kept drifting back to James's words in the barn. Mrs. Caldwell entered the kitchen just as Elena was pulling the golden biscuits from the oven, her gray hair already perfectly arranged despite the early hour. Margaret Caldwell was a woman who believed in starting each day with purpose and order, and she expected the same from everyone in her household. "Good morning, Elena," she said, moving to pour herself coffee from the pot that always sat ready on the stove. "I trust you slept well?" "Yes, ma'am," Elena replied automatically, though sleep had been the furthest thing from her mind for the past 3 nights. Mrs. Caldwell studied her with sharp blue eyes. Elena had always suspected that the older woman saw more than she let on, noticed things that others missed. It was one of the qualities that made her both a formidable ranch wife and a fair employer. "You seem distracted lately, Mrs. Caldwell observed, settling into her chair at the small kitchen table, where she often took her first cup of coffee before the family breakfast. "Is everything all right?" Elena's hands stilled on the gravy spoon. How could she explain that her entire world had been turned upside down by her employer's son? That she was torn between a dream she hardly dared acknowledge and the practical reality of her situation? "I'm fine, ma'am," she said quietly. "Just tired, I suppose." Mrs. Caldwell hummed thoughtfully, a sound Elena had learned to recognize. It meant the older woman was thinking, weighing what she observed against what she was being told. "Elena, you've been with our family for 5 years now," Mrs. Caldwell said carefully. "In that time, you've become more than just our housekeeper. You've become, well, almost like family." Elena's heart skipped a beat. Where was this conversation leading? "You know that Mr. Caldwell and I think very highly of you," the older woman continued. "Your work ethic, your character, your kindness to everyone on this ranch. We've watched you grow from a frightened girl into a confident young woman." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "So, when I see you troubled about something, it concerns me, not as your employer, but as someone who cares about your well-being." The kindness in Mrs. Caldwell's voice nearly undid Elena's composure. She had been so focused on the differences between herself and the Caldwell family that she had almost forgotten how they had welcomed her, protected her, treated her with more respect than many employers showed their help. "Mrs. Caldwell," Elena began hesitantly, then stopped. How could she possibly explain her dilemma without revealing James's feelings? It wasn't her place to speak of such things. The sound of boots on the back porch saved her from having to continue. Both women looked toward the door as it opened to reveal James, his work clothes already dusty from the morning chores. He carried a full pail of milk, and his eyes met Elena's with a meaningful look. "Morning, Mother," he said, setting the milk pail on the counter. "Elena." "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Caldwell replied, but Elena noticed how the older woman's gaze moved between her son and the housekeeper, her expression thoughtful. James moved to wash his hands at the kitchen basin, and Elena tried to focus on finishing the breakfast preparations. But she was intensely aware of his presence, of the way he moved with easy confidence through the kitchen, of how he hummed softly under his breath as he worked. "James," his mother said suddenly, "I received a letter from the Hendersons yesterday. They're planning a barn raising next month and have invited our family to attend." Elena felt James tense, though he continued washing his hands as if nothing had changed. "That's nice," he said carefully. "Their daughter Lucy will be there, of course. Such a lovely girl. And accomplished. She's been studying piano in Denver, you know." Elena's stomach dropped. Lucy Henderson was everything Elena was not: educated, refined, from a good family. She had pale blonde hair and blue eyes and Elena had heard the ranch hands talking about how pretty she was. "Mother," James said, a warning note in his voice. But Mrs. Caldwell continued, as if she hadn't heard him. "I know you've been focused on the ranch these past few years, but you're 26 now, James. It's time you started thinking about settling down, starting a family of your own." Elena gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. This was reality intruding on the impossible dream James had painted in the barn. This was the reminder she needed of where she truly stood in the world. "I am thinking about settling down," James said quietly, turning to face his mother. "Just not with Lucy Henderson." Mrs. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "Oh, is there someone else who's caught your attention?" The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Elena held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to make a sound that might draw attention to herself. "There might be," James said finally, his eyes flickering toward Elena before returning to his mother's face. Mrs. Caldwell followed her son's glance, and Elena felt the older woman's sharp gaze settle on her like a weight. For a moment, the kitchen was completely silent, except for the bubble of gravy on the stove and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pasture. "I see," Mrs. Caldwell said slowly. Elena couldn't bear it anymore. She mumbled something about needing to check on the dining room and fled, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Behind her, she heard the low murmur of voices as mother and son continued their conversation, but she couldn't make out the words. In the dining room, Elena busied herself with unnecessary tasks, straightening chairs that were already straight, polishing silver that already gleamed. Through the window, she could see Mr. Caldwell walking toward the house, his weathered face set in its usual serious expression. Robert Caldwell was a man of few words but strong principles. He had built this ranch from nothing, turning thousands of acres of wild grassland into one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. Elena had always respected him, but she had never been able to read him the way she could his wife and son. The front door opened, and Mr. Caldwell's heavy footsteps echoed through the house as he made his way to the dining room. He nodded to Elena as he entered, hanging his hat on the hook by the door. "Morning, Elena. Smells good in here." "Thank you, sir. Breakfast will be ready in just a few minutes." Mr. Caldwell settled into his chair at the head of the long wooden table, and Elena began setting out the serving dishes. She had done this same routine hundreds of times, but today her hand shook slightly as she arranged the plates and silverware. "Elena," Mr. Caldwell said suddenly, his deep voice making her jump. "Yes, sir? You've been with us a long time now. 5 years, isn't it?" "Yes, sir." "You've done good work. Honest work. Margaret and I, we appreciate that." Elena nodded, unsure where this conversation was leading. First, Mrs. Caldwell in the kitchen, now her husband in the dining room. Had they somehow sensed what was happening between her and James? "A person's character matters more than their circumstances," Mr. Caldwell continued, his gray eyes studying her face. "Where you come from, who your people are, how much money you have in the bank, none of that matters as much as what's in here." He tapped his chest over his heart. Elena's breath caught. Was he trying to tell her something? Was this his way of saying that he would accept her, despite everything? Before she could respond, Mrs. Caldwell and James entered the dining room together. Elena couldn't read the expression on either of their faces, but something had clearly been discussed in the kitchen after she left. The family settled around the table as Elena served breakfast, the familiar rhythm of the morning meal proceeding as it always did. But tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm, and Elena found herself jumping at every small sound. "James tells me he's been helping you with some of the heavier chores," Mr. Caldwell said as Elena refilled his coffee cup. Elena's hand trembled slightly. "He's been very kind, sir." That's what neighbors do for each other. Help out when it's needed. Neighbors. Not family. Not equals. Neighbors. Elena felt her heart sink as the subtle reminder of her place in the household settled over her like a cold blanket. But then James spoke up, his voice firm and clear. "Elena is more than a neighbor to this family, Father. She's been loyal and hardworking and kind for 5 years. She deserves our respect and consideration." Mr. Caldwell's eyebrows rose slightly at his son's passionate defense, and Elena felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and gratitude in equal measure. Of course she does, the older man said mildly. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. Elena excused herself to return to the kitchen, needing space to breathe and think. As she began washing the breakfast dishes, she could hear the family's conversation continuing in the dining room, though she couldn't make out specific words. Her mind raced as she worked. The Caldwells had always been kind to her, but kindness was different from acceptance. Kind employers might treat their help with respect and consideration, but that didn't mean they would welcome that same person as a daughter-in-law. And yet, there had been something in Mrs. Caldwell's eyes when she looked between Elena and James. Not anger or disapproval, but something more like understanding. And Mr. Caldwell's words about character mattering more than circumstances had that been coincidence, or had he been trying to tell her something? Elena was so lost in thought that she didn't hear footsteps approaching until a voice spoke right behind her. Elena. She spun around, her wet hands dripping onto the kitchen floor, to find James standing in the doorway. His expression was serious, determined, and Elena felt her heart begin to race again. We need to talk, he said quietly. I'm working, Elena protested weakly. The dishes can wait. James stepped closer, and Elena backed against the counter, trapped between the kitchen basin and his approaching form. But he stopped just out of reach, giving her space while making it clear that he wasn't going to let her run away again. My parents know, he said simply. Elena's legs went weak. What? Not everything, but they know I have feelings for someone. They've suspected for weeks, apparently. Mother says she's been watching us, seeing how we look at each other when we think no one is paying attention. Elena pressed her hands to her burning cheeks. Had she been so obvious? Had everyone on the ranch been talking about the foolish Mexican girl who had developed feelings for her employer's son? Elena, listen to me, James continued, his voice gentle but insistent. They want to meet with you. Tonight, after supper. They want to talk about us. There is no us, Elena whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. James stepped closer then, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, could smell the familiar scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes. Isn't there? He asked softly. Look me in the eye, and tell me you feel nothing. Tell me that when I walk into a room, your heart doesn't skip a beat. Tell me that you don't think about me when you're lying in bed at night, wondering what it would be like if things were different. Elena opened her mouth to deny it, to lie and protect herself from the pain that would surely come. But the words wouldn't come, because everything he said was true, and they both knew it. I can't, she whispered. Then don't, James said fiercely. Don't lie to me, and don't lie to yourself. What we have is real, Elena. It's worth fighting for. Tears blurred Elena's vision. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love could overcome the obstacles between them. But she had lived too long with disappointment to let hope take root easily. What if they say no? She asked, her voice barely audible. What if they forbid it? James reached out then, his calloused fingers gentle as they brushed a tear from her cheek. Then we'll face that together, he said firmly. But Elena, I need you to give us a chance. I need you to believe that what we have is worth the risk. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his touch, the steady strength in his voice. For 5 years, she had been careful, practical, safe. She had built walls around her heart and kept her dreams small and manageable. But standing here in the kitchen with James's hand on her face and hope blooming in her chest despite her fears, Elena realized that some things were worth the risk of heartbreak. Okay, she whispered. Okay? Elena opened her eyes and met his gaze, seeing the hope and love and determination there. Okay, I'll talk to them. I'll try to believe. James's smile was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. For a moment, Elena forgot all her fears and doubts, lost in the joy of seeing him happy. But reality returned quickly enough. Tonight, she would sit across from Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell and try to explain why she thought she deserved their son's love. Tonight, her future would be decided by people who held her fate in their hands. Tonight, everything would change. The letter arrived with the afternoon mail, carried by old Pete Murphy, who rode the postal route between towns twice a week. Elena was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she saw him approaching, his dusty horse moving at its usual tired pace through the July heat. Something about the way Pete's weathered face looked more serious than usual made Elena's stomach clench with worry. In her experience, unexpected letters rarely brought good news, especially for people like her, who had left family behind in distant places. Mrs. Caldwell met Pete at the front gate, accepting the small bundle of mail with her usual polite nod. Elena watched from behind the fluttering bed sheets as the older woman sorted through the envelopes, her expression growing concerned as she examined one particular piece of correspondence. "Elena," Mrs. Caldwell called across the yard, "could you come here, please?" Elena's hands trembled as she pinned the last pillowcase to the line. The tone in Mrs. Caldwell's voice was gentle but urgent, the same tone she used when delivering difficult news. Elena's mind immediately jumped to the worst possibilities as she walked toward the front of the house. Mrs. Caldwell held out a cream-colored envelope, and Elena's heart sank as she recognized her sister Maria's careful handwriting. Maria only wrote when something was terribly wrong. The last letter had come 3 years ago, when their youngest brother had broken his leg in a mining accident. "It's addressed to you, dear," Mrs. Caldwell said softly, her blue eyes full of concern. Elena accepted the letter with numb fingers, staring at her name written in Maria's familiar script. Part of her wanted to tear it open immediately, while another part wanted to burn it unread, as if destroying the letter could somehow prevent whatever bad news it contained. Mrs. Caldwell seemed to understand her hesitation. "Would you like some privacy to read it? You can use the parlor if you'd prefer." "Thank you," Elena whispered, grateful for the kindness. The parlor was the nicest room in the Caldwell house, with its polished wooden furniture and delicate lace curtains. Elena had cleaned this room countless times but had rarely sat in it. The horsehair sofa felt stiff and formal beneath her as she carefully opened the envelope with shaking hands. Maria's letter was brief, written in Spanish with the hurried strokes of someone who had difficult news to share. "My dearest Elena, I pray this letter finds you in good health. I write with heavy heart to tell you that Papa is very sick. The doctor says his lungs are failing from too many years in the mines. He asks for you every day, calls your name in his sleep. Mama tries to be strong, but I see how she cries when she thinks no one is watching. The doctor says Papa may not last the month. If you want to see him before he goes to be with God, you must come soon. I know it is much to ask, but Papa's greatest wish is to hold his Elena one more time. I have saved a little money for your journey home. Please come if you can. Your loving sister, Maria." Elena read the letter 3 times before the words truly sank in. Papa was dying. The man who had worked himself to exhaustion to provide for his family, who had sung Mexican folk songs while teaching her to braid rope, who had cried the day she left for Wyoming territory he was slipping away. And he wanted to see her. Tears blurred her vision as she folded the letter carefully. The timing felt like a cruel joke from fate. Just when James had declared his love, just when she had finally agreed to believe that happiness might be possible, her past was calling her back. A soft knock on the parlor door made her look up. Mrs. Caldwell stood in the doorway, her expression full of sympathy. "Bad news?" the older woman asked gently. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Mrs. Caldwell moved into the room and settled into the chair across from the sofa, her posture radiating quiet support. "My father," Elena managed to say. The doctor says he's dying. My sister wants me to come home." Mrs. Caldwell's face softened with genuine sorrow. "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry. How long has it been since you've seen your family?" 5 years. Not since I came here." The admission hung in the air between them. 5 years of faithful service, of sending most of her wages home to help her family, of missing birthdays and holidays, and all the small moments that made up a life. Elena had sacrificed so much to help her family survive, and now she might lose her father before she could see him again. "You'll need to leave soon if you want to reach him in time," Mrs. Caldwell said practically. The journey to New Mexico will take at least 2 weeks by stagecoach and train. Elena's heart clenched. 2 weeks there. Time with her family. Then 2 weeks back if she came back at all. How could she explain to Maria that she had found love in Wyoming territory? How could she choose between the family that needed her and the man who wanted to marry her? Mrs. Caldwell, Elena began hesitantly. About tonight. About the conversation with you and Mr. Caldwell. The older woman's expression grew thoughtful. Yes, James mentioned that he had spoken with you about our desire to discuss certain matters. Elena felt her cheeks burn. Even now, with her world falling apart, the thought of that conversation made her nervous. I don't know if I should, with everything that's happened. Elena, Mrs. Caldwell interrupted gently. May I ask you something? Elena nodded. Do you love my son? The direct question caught Elena off guard. She had expected criticism, warnings about knowing her place, reminders of the social differences between them. She had not expected this quiet, straightforward inquiry about her feelings. Elena struggled to find the right words. I care for him very much. But Mrs. Caldwell, I know what people will say. I know the problems it would cause for your family. I'm not the kind of woman who... That's not what I asked, Mrs. Caldwell said firmly. I asked if you love him. Elena met the older woman's steady gaze and saw no judgment there, only genuine curiosity, and perhaps a hint of understanding. Yes, Elena whispered. I love him. Mrs. Caldwell nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. And does he love you? He says he does. James is not a man given to saying things he doesn't mean, Mrs. Caldwell observed. If he has told you he loves you, then you can believe it. Elena felt tears threatening again. This conversation was not going at all as she had expected. Where were the objections? The reminders of their different stations in life? I need to go to my father, Elena said quietly. I may not come back. The words surprised her even as she spoke them. Until this moment, she hadn't realized that returning to New Mexico was even a possibility. But sitting here in the Caldwell parlor, holding Maria's letter, Elena suddenly understood that she had a choice to make. That would be a great loss, Mrs. Caldwell said simply, for all of us, but especially for James. It would be easier for everyone if I just went away. You could find him a suitable wife, someone from a good family, someone like Lucy Henderson. Mrs. Caldwell made a sound that might have been laughter or frustration. Elena, dear, James has shown no interest in Lucy Henderson or any other suitable young woman. In fact, he's made it quite clear that his heart is already engaged elsewhere. Elena stared at the older woman, trying to understand what she was really saying. Was Mrs. Caldwell actually suggesting that she would accept Elena as a daughter-in-law? But the differences between us, Elena began, are not as important as you think they are, Mrs. Caldwell finished. Elena, you've been part of this family for 5 years. You've shown yourself to be honest, hardworking, and kind. You've earned our respect and affection. If James has chosen you, then we trust his judgment. Elena felt like the world was spinning around her. This was not the conversation she had expected, not the reaction she had prepared herself for. Mrs. Caldwell was not just accepting the possibility of Elena. As a daughter-in-law, she seemed to actually approve of it. I don't understand, Elena said weakly. Why aren't you angry? Why aren't you telling me to know my place? Mrs. Caldwell's expression grew sad. Elena, do you think so little of us? Do you believe we would judge a person's worth by their circumstances rather than their character? Elena felt ashamed of her assumptions, but they had been based on years of experience. She had seen how the world worked, how people like her were treated by people in positions of power. I've seen how things are, Elena said quietly. In town, at church, everywhere. People like me. We're not supposed to marry people like James. People like you, Mrs. Caldwell repeated thoughtfully. You mean people who work hard, show loyalty, demonstrate kindness to others? People who sacrifice their own comfort for their family's welfare? Elena, those are exactly the kind of people I want my son to marry. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted their conversation. Elena heard the door open and close, followed by James's voice calling for his mother. "We're in the parlor, dear," Mrs. Caldwell called back. James appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up when he saw Elena, but his expression quickly changed to concern as he noticed her tear-stained cheeks and the letter clutched in her hands. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, moving into the room. Elena held out Maria's letter without speaking. James read it quickly, his face growing grave as he absorbed the contents. "When do you need to leave?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "As soon as possible," Elena whispered. "If I want to see him, if I want to say goodbye." James was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter. When he looked up, his brown eyes were full of pain and understanding. "Then we'll get you on the next stage to Denver," he said firmly. "From there you can catch the train south." Elena felt her heart breaking. James was willing to let her go, to risk losing her forever, because he understood that she needed to be with her family. The generosity of it, the selflessness, made her love him even more. "James," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't say anything you might regret later. Just go to your father. Be with your family. We'll figure out the rest when you get back." "If I get back," Elena corrected softly. James's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "If you get back." Mrs. Caldwell had been listening to this exchange with growing concern. Now she spoke up, her voice firm and decisive. "Elena, before you make any final decisions about your future, I want you to know something. Tonight's conversation doesn't have to wait until you return. I can tell you right now what Mr. Caldwell and I have decided." Elena and James both turned to look at her, surprised by the sudden declaration. "We would be honored to welcome you into our family," Mrs. Caldwell said simply. "If that's what you and James want, you have our blessing." Elena felt like she couldn't breathe. The words she had never dared hope to hear were hanging in the air between them, offered freely and without reservation. James moved to kneel beside the sofa, taking Elena's hands in his own. "Elena, I know the timing is terrible. I know you need to go to your family right now. But before you leave, I need you to know that when you're ready, if you're ready, I'll be here waiting for you." Elena looked between James's earnest face and Mrs. Caldwell's kind expression, feeling overwhelmed by the love and acceptance being offered to her. For 5 years, she had believed herself unworthy of such generosity. Now she was being given everything she had ever wanted, and she had to leave it behind to rush to her dying father's bedside. "I have to go," she whispered, hating the necessity, even as she accepted it. "I know," James said softly, "and I'll help you get there as quickly as possible." Elena squeezed his hands, drawing strength from his steady presence. Whatever happened in New Mexico, whatever choices she had to make about her future, she would carry this moment with her, the moment when she learned that love could be stronger than social barriers, that acceptance could triumph over prejudice. But first, she had to say goodbye to her father, and that journey would test her heart in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Elena packed her few belongings by candlelight that evening, her hands moving automatically through the familiar task, while her mind wrestled with the impossible choice before her. The small room that had been her home for 5 years seemed different now, both precious because of the memories it held and suddenly too small to contain all the emotions churning inside her. She had 2 dresses, both worn but carefully mended, a pair of sturdy boots that had carried her through countless days of ranch work, a wooden comb that had been her mother's, a small silver cross on a chain, the only jewelry she owned. As she folded each item and placed it in her traveling bag, Elena tried to imagine explaining to Maria why she might not be coming home to stay. How could she tell her sister that she had fallen in love with her employer's son? How could she explain that the Caldwell family had welcomed her as if she were already a daughter, not just hired help? In New Mexico, such a story would sound like a foolish dream, the kind of impossible romance that existed only in the books Elena read by firelight when her chores were done. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Elena opened it to find James standing in the hallway, his face serious in the flickering candlelight. He held something wrapped in brown paper, about the size of a book. "I brought you something for the journey," he said quietly. glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. Even though his parents had given their blessing, the household was still adjusting to this new reality, and discretion seemed wise. Elena accepted the package, surprised by its weight. "James, you don't need to." "Open it," he said, his eyes intense with some emotion she couldn't quite read. Elena carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with an intricate pattern of roses and vines. The leather was soft and rich, clearly expensive, and Elena's breath caught as she realized what he was giving her. "It belonged to my sister Catherine," James explained softly. "She liked to write stories, poems, letters to imaginary friends. Mother saved it after she died, but I think Catherine would have wanted you to have it." Elena opened the journal to find the first few pages covered with a young girl's careful handwriting, but most of the book remained blank, waiting for new words to fill its pages. "I thought you could write to me," James continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Tell me about your journey, about your family. Help me understand what you're thinking and feeling while we're apart." Elena looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability in his expression. He was afraid she wouldn't come back, afraid that distance and family obligations would pull her away from Wyoming territory forever. The journal was his way of keeping them connected across the miles. "I'm not good with writing," Elena protested weakly. "My English, my spelling." "Your English is perfect when you speak from your heart," James said firmly. "And your spelling doesn't matter to me. What matters is that you share your thoughts with me, even when we can't be together." Elena clutched the journal to her chest, feeling the weight of Catherine's memory and James's love in its pages. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll write to you every day." James smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him since the letter arrived. "Good, because I'll be counting on those letters to keep me sane while you're gone." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, both aware that this might be the last time they were alone together for weeks, or possibly forever. Elena memorized the details of his face, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the gold flecks in his brown eyes that seemed to catch and hold the candlelight. "Elena," James said suddenly, his voice urgent, "before you go, I need you to know something. Whatever happens in New Mexico, whatever you decide about your future, these past few days have been the happiest of my life. You've given me hope for things I never thought I could have." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "James." "Let me finish," he said gently. "I know you're scared about leaving your family again if you come back here. I know you're worried about fitting into a world that might not always welcome you. But Elena, I want you to know that wherever you are, that's where I want to be too. If you decide to stay in New Mexico, I'll find a way to come to you. If you want to build a life somewhere else entirely, we'll do it together." The sincerity in his voice took Elena's breath away. James Caldwell, who had been born to inherit thousands of acres of Wyoming territory, was willing to give it all up for her. The magnitude of that offer, the depth of love it represented, made Elena feel dizzy with emotion. "You would do that," she whispered. "Leave your family's ranch, everything you've worked for." "In a heartbeat," James said without hesitation. "Elena, this ranch, this land, it's just dirt and grass and cattle. You're the one who makes it feel like home." Before Elena could respond, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made them both step back. Mrs. Caldwell appeared around the corner, carrying a small basket that smelled like fresh bread and coffee. "I thought you might want some provisions for your journey," she said, offering Elena the basket. "The food on stagecoaches can be questionable." Elena accepted the basket gratefully, touched by the older woman's thoughtfulness. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell, for everything." "Margaret," the older woman corrected gently. "If you're going to be part of this family, you should call me Margaret." The casual way she said it, as if Elena's return and acceptance were already settled facts, made Elena's heart skip. Margaret Caldwell was not a woman given to empty gestures or false promises. If she was already thinking of Elena as family, it meant she truly believed in the future James had proposed. "Now then," Margaret continued briskly, "the stage leaves Cheyenne at 7 in the morning. James will drive you to town tonight so you can stay at the hotel and be ready for departure. The journey to Denver will take 2 days, and from there, you can catch the train to Santa Fe." Elena nodded, trying to absorb all the practical details while her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. This was really happening. In a few hours, she would be leaving the only real home she had known since childhood, possibly forever. "Mrs. Margaret," Elena corrected herself. What if my family needs me to stay? What if I can't come back?" Margaret's expression softened with understanding. "Then you'll do what you must for your family, just as you always have. But Elena, remember that you have a family here too now. Whatever decision you make, we'll support you." The unconditional acceptance in Margaret's voice nearly undid Elena's composure. She had spent so many years believing that her worth was tied to her usefulness, that people cared for her only as long as she could work for them. The idea that the Caldwells would support her, even if she chose to leave permanently, was almost too much to process. A rumble of thunder, closer now, reminded them all of the storm that had been building throughout the evening. James moved to the window and peered out at the dark sky. "We should leave soon if we want to reach town before the worst of the weather hits," he said, though his reluctance was obvious in every line of his body. Elena nodded and closed her traveling bag, her movements suddenly urgent. The approaching storm felt like an omen, a reminder that some forces were beyond human control. She could plan and hope and make promises, but ultimately, the future remained as unpredictable as Wyoming weather. "I'm ready," she said, though she felt anything but ready to leave the people and place that had become so precious to her. James took her bag without being asked, and Margaret surprised Elena by pulling her into a warm embrace. "Travel safely, dear," the older woman murmured. "And remember, you have a home here whenever you want to return to it." Elena hugged her back, feeling the strength and warmth of the woman who had become like a mother to her. "Thank you for everything, for believing in me." "We believe in love," Margaret corrected gently, "and anyone who loves my son as clearly as you do is welcome in this family." As they prepared to leave for town, Elena took one last look around the small room that had sheltered her for 5 years. Tomorrow, this space would be empty, waiting for her return, or for someone new to fill it. The uncertainty was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. James appeared in the doorway, her bag in one hand and a lantern in the other. "The wagon's ready," he said softly. Elena picked up Catherine's journal and followed him out into the hallway, her heart pounding with the rhythm of thunder and possibility. Behind them, Margaret stood watching, her figure silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the kitchen. Outside, the air was thick with the promise of rain, and lightning flickered on the horizon like signals from some distant world. As James helped Elena up onto the wagon seat, she realized that she was about to embark on more than just a journey to New Mexico. She was stepping into the unknown territory of her own future, where love and duty would wage war for her heart. The first fat raindrops began to fall as they pulled away from the ranch house, and Elena clutched Catherine's journal to her chest like a talisman. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the knowledge that she was loved truly, completely, unconditionally loved. But first, she had to say goodbye to her father, and in that goodbye, she would have to decide who Elena Vasquez was meant to become. "You came back to us for him?" Maria's voice cut through the adobe walls of their childhood home like a whip crack, her dark eyes blazing with hurt and disbelief as Elena sat beside their father's bed 3 weeks later. Elena's heart sank as she watched her sister's face transform from joy to betrayal. The reunion had been everything she had hoped for. Papa was still alive, though frighteningly thin, and the whole family had gathered to welcome her home. But now, after reading James's latest letter aloud, Elena faced a fury she hadn't expected. "Maria, please," Elena whispered, glancing toward their father who dozed fitfully on the narrow bed. "Let me explain." "Explain what? That you've forgotten who you are? That you think you're too good for your own people now?" Maria's voice rose dangerously, and their mother appeared in the doorway, her weathered face creased with worry. "Girls, please," Mama said softly. "Your father needs rest." But Papa's eyes fluttered open at the sound of raised voices. Despite his illness, His gaze was still sharp as it moved between his daughters. "What troubles you, my girls?" Elena felt trapped between two worlds: the dusty adobe house, where she had learned to speak Spanish and pray to the Virgin Mary, and the Wyoming ranch, where she had discovered love and possibility. How could she make her family understand that loving James didn't mean abandoning her heritage? "Papa," Elena began carefully, "I've told you about the Caldwell family, how kind they've been to me. See, mija, good people. They treat you with respect. Their son, James, he wants to marry me." The silence that followed was deafening. Papa's breathing was the only sound in the small room, labored and shallow. Maria stood frozen by the window, her hands clenched into fists. Mama crossed herself and murmured a prayer under her breath. Finally, Papa spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Does he love you truly? Not just lonely feelings?" Elena's throat tightened with emotion. Even dying, her father's first concern was protecting her heart. "Yes, Papa, and his family has accepted me. They want me to be part of their family." Papa nodded slowly, but Maria exploded with renewed anger. "And what about our family? What about Mama, who cries every night because her daughter is so far away? What about me, working my fingers raw to keep food on this table? What about Roberto, who asks every day when his sister Elena is coming home for good?" Each word hit Elena like a physical blow. She had sent money home faithfully for 5 years, but money couldn't replace her presence. Money couldn't help Mama with the cooking and cleaning. Money couldn't give Maria someone to talk to during the long, lonely evenings. "I never meant to hurt anyone," Elena said quietly, "but I can't live my whole life trying to make up for leaving. I can't stay here just because you need me to." "Can't you?" Maria's voice cracked with pain. "Papa is dying, Elena. Mama is getting older every day. Roberto is only 15, he needs guidance. And you want to run back to your rich boyfriend and play pretend that you belong in his world?" Elena stood up abruptly, her own anger finally matching her sister's. "It's not pretend. James loves me for who I am, not for what I can do for him. His family respects me, values me. They see me as more than just hands to work and a mouth to feed." The moment the words left her mouth, Elena regretted them. Maria's face went white, and Mama made a small sound of hurt surprise. "Is that what you think of us?" Maria whispered. "That we only value you for your work?" Elena felt sick with shame. "No, that's not what I meant." "But it's what you said," Papa interrupted, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "Elena, come here." Elena approached the bed reluctantly, knowing she was about to receive the lecture she deserved. But when Papa took her hand in his thin, calloused fingers, his expression was sad rather than angry. "Mija, love is a gift from God. If this man truly loves you, if his family accepts you, then perhaps this is God's plan for your life. But family is also God's gift. You cannot throw away one gift to claim another." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "What am I supposed to do, Papa? How can I choose?" "Maybe," Papa said slowly, "you don't have to choose. Maybe there is another way." Before Elena could ask what he meant, the sound of horses in the courtyard outside made them all freeze. Visitors were rare in their small village, especially in the evening. Through the window, Elena saw 2 men dismounting from tired horses, their clothes dusty from travel. Her heart stopped as she recognized the taller figure. James had come to New Mexico. Maria saw him too, and turned to Elena with fresh fury. "You wrote to him. You told him to come here." "No," Elena protested. "I never." But her words were lost as Mama hurried to answer the knock at the front door. Elena heard voices in the front room. Mama's careful English mixed with James's patient, respectful tone and another man's voice she didn't recognize. "Elena?" Mama called. "You have visitors." Elena's legs felt weak as she walked to the front room, where James stood hat in hand beside a shorter, older man with kind eyes and silver hair. Both men looked tired and dusty from their journey, but James's face lit up when he saw her. "Elena," he said softly, and the love in his voice made her heart ache with longing and confusion. "This is my father, Robert Caldwell," James said, gesturing to the older man. He wanted to meet your family. Elena stared at James's father in shock. Robert Caldwell had traveled all the way to New Mexico just to meet her family. The gesture was so unexpected, so respectful, that Elena felt tears spring to her eyes. "Mr. Caldwell," she managed to say, this is such a surprise." Robert Caldwell's weathered face creased into a gentle smile. "Miss Vasquez, James has told me so much about you and your family. I hope you don't mind our unannounced visit, but when we learned of your father's illness, we felt it was important to come and pay our respects." The formal politeness of his words couldn't hide the genuine warmth in his voice. This was not a man coming to claim his son's property or assert his superiority. This was a father coming to meet the woman his son loved, showing respect for her family and circumstances. Maria appeared in the doorway behind Elena, her expression wary but curious. Mama hovered nearby, clearly flustered by having such distinguished visitors in her humble home. "Please," Elena said, finding her manners at last. "Come in. Sit down. Can I get you some water? Coffee?" "Water would be wonderful," Robert said gratefully. "It's been a long ride." As Elena moved to fetch refreshments, her mind raced. Why were they here? What did this visit mean for her impossible choice between family and love? James caught her hand as she passed him, his fingers warm and familiar. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "There are things you need to know, things that might change everything." Elena looked into his eyes and saw determination, hope, and something else, something that looked like the answer to prayers she hadn't dared pray. But first, she had to get through whatever conversation was about to happen between the Caldwells and her family. And judging by the tension radiating from Maria and the worry in Mama's eyes, it was going to be the most important conversation of her life. Papa insisted on getting out of bed to meet the visitors, despite Mama's worried protests, and Elena watched nervously as James helped her father to his chair in the front room. The contrast between the two men was striking. James, young and strong, Papa frighteningly frail, but there was instant respect in the way they looked at each other. "Mr. Vasquez," Robert Caldwell said formally, "thank you for receiving us in your home. I know this is a difficult time for your family." Papa straightened in his chair, summoning the dignity that illness couldn't touch. "Any friend of my Elena is welcome here. She writes that your family has been good to her." "She has been a blessing to us," Robert replied simply. "In 5 years, we have come to think of Elena as family." Elena felt her breath catch. The easy way Robert said it, the matter-of-fact tone, made it clear he wasn't just being polite. He meant every word. Maria stepped forward, her chin raised in challenge. "If you think of her as family, then why did you let her leave? Why didn't you stop her from making this terrible journey when she was needed at home?" Elena flinched at her sister's bluntness, but Robert didn't seem offended. Instead, he studied Maria with the same careful attention he might give to a horse he was considering buying. "Because," he said slowly, "family doesn't mean ownership. Elena chose to come to her father's bedside because she loves him. We would never stand in the way of love, even if it costs us dearly." The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge. Maria's eyes narrowed, but she seemed to recognize the steel beneath Robert's gentle words. James cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Vasquez, there's something I need to tell you, something that might change how you feel about Elena coming back to Wyoming." Elena's heart began to race. What was James talking about? What secret had he and his father traveled so far to share? "3 months ago," James continued, "my father decided to split the ranch. He's giving me the eastern section 2,000 acres with good water and grazing. I'm going to build my own house there, start my own herd." Elena stared at him in shock. James had never mentioned any of this in his letters. The eastern section was some of the best land on the Caldwell ranch, valuable enough to make any man wealthy. "That's wonderful," Elena said weakly, not understanding why this news required a journey to New Mexico to deliver. Robert leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious. "Elena, what my son is trying to say is that we want to make you an offer. Not just you, but your whole family." The room went completely silent. Even Papa's labored breathing seemed to quiet as everyone waited for Robert to continue. "Your sister Maria," Robert said, looking directly at the young woman. "James tells me you're skilled with numbers, that you help manage the family's finances. Maria nodded suspiciously. I need someone to help manage the books for our cattle sales. Someone I can trust. Someone who understands the value of hard work. The position would pay well enough to support your family comfortably. Maria's mouth fell open. You're offering me a job? I'm offering your whole family a new start, Robert corrected. Maria, you would work with our accountant in town. Your mother could help Margaret with the household if she wanted, or simply enjoy having her own home without worrying about money. Your brother Roberto could learn ranching, or go to school, or both. Elena felt dizzy. This was impossible. The Caldwells couldn't just uproot her entire family and move them to Wyoming territory. And Papa? Elena whispered. Robert's expression softened. Your father would be honored as an elder of our community. The dry air in Wyoming might actually help his breathing. We have a good doctor in town, someone who understands lung ailments from the mining regions. Papa was staring at Robert with something like wonder. You would do this? For people you don't know? I would do this, Robert said firmly. For Elena's family. Because Elena matters to us. Because family takes care of family. Elena looked around the room at her family's stunned faces. Mama was crying silently, her hands pressed to her mouth. Maria looked torn between suspicion and hope. Roberto, who had been silent in the corner, was staring at James like he was some kind of hero from a storybook. I don't understand, Elena said weakly. Why would you offer this? What do you gain? James moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. We gain you, Elena. We gain the knowledge that you'll never have to choose between the people you love. We gain a family that's complete instead of divided. Elena felt tears streaming down her face. The impossible choice that had been tearing her apart for weeks was dissolving before her eyes. She could have James and keep her family. She could build a future without destroying her past. But Maria stepped forward, her expression still skeptical. And what if it doesn't work? What if we hate Wyoming? What if we can't adapt to your way of life? Robert smiled at her directness. Then you can come home. I'll pay for your return journey and help you get established again. This offer comes with no strings attached, no obligations beyond giving it an honest try. Papa struggled to his feet, and James immediately moved to support him. The old man studied Robert's face for a long moment, as if trying to read his soul. You are a good man, Signor Caldwell, Papa said finally. But I am dying. This journey, it might kill me. Papa, no, Elena protested, but he held up a weak hand to silence her. It might kill me, Papa continued, but staying here will definitely kill me. If I am going to die, I would rather die knowing my children have a chance for happiness. The simple courage in his words made Elena's heart break and soar at the same time. Even facing death, Papa was thinking of their futures, their possibilities. So we accept? Maria asked, her voice small and uncertain. Papa nodded slowly. We accept. And we thank God for sending angels to our door. James squeezed Elena's hands, his eyes bright with joy and relief. Does this mean you'll marry me? That you'll be my wife and help me build our life together? Elena looked around the room at the faces of everyone she loved, her family, who had shaped her, James, who had chosen her, Robert, who had welcomed her. For the first time in weeks, her heart felt light and free. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, I'll marry you. The room erupted in celebration, with Mama crying and laughing at the same time, Roberto whooping with excitement, and Maria actually smiling for the first time since Elena had arrived. Papa sank back into his chair, his face peaceful with contentment. But Elena barely heard the commotion around her. She was lost in James's eyes, in the promise of a future that included everyone she loved. The choice that had seemed impossible just minutes ago had transformed into a gift beyond her wildest dreams. Love hadn't demanded that she sacrifice family after all. Instead, it had found a way to embrace them all. The church bells were ringing across the Wyoming Valley as Elena stood frozen in the doorway of the little white chapel, her wedding dress suddenly feeling like a costume she had no right to wear. Through the open doors, She could see the entire town packed into the wooden pews, faces she recognized from 5 years of quiet service, now staring at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disapproval. "I can't do this," Elena whispered to Maria, who stood beside her holding a bouquet of wildflowers they had picked that morning. "Look at their faces. They think I'm making a mistake." Maria squeezed her sister's trembling hand. "Elena, you've come too far to turn back now. James is waiting for you at that altar, and he looks like a man who would wait forever if he had to." Elena's eyes found James at the front of the church, standing tall and handsome in his Sunday best. His brown eyes were fixed on her with such love and certainty that her heart skipped a beat. Beside him stood his father, Robert, who had become like a second papa to her in the months since their families moved to Wyoming. Behind them, she could see Mama sitting in the front pew, tears of joy streaming down her weathered cheeks. But it was the whispers from the other pews that made Elena's stomach churn with fear. "Can you believe it? The housekeeper thinking she can marry above her station. Poor James probably doesn't realize what he's getting himself into. Mark my words, this won't last a year." Elena had heard similar comments for weeks leading up to this day. The banker's wife had made pointed remarks about appropriate marriages at the general store. The preacher's daughter had suggested that perhaps Elena should consider her place in God's plan before making such a big decision. Even some of the ranch hands had made jokes about James being lassoed by his own help. Elena, Margaret Caldwell, appeared at her elbow, elegant in her navy blue dress, her kind eyes full of understanding. "I know this feels overwhelming, dear. But remember, these people don't matter. What matters is the love you and James share." Elena wanted to believe Margaret's words, but the weight of so many disapproving stares felt crushing. She had dreamed of this day for months, but she had imagined it differently, with smiling faces and warm congratulations, not hushed whispers and judgmental glances. "What if they're right?" Elena asked quietly. "What if I am reaching too high? What if I embarrass James and your family?" Margaret's expression hardened with determination. "Elena Caldwelland, yes, dear. You are already a Caldwell in our hearts. You listen to me. You have more grace, kindness, and strength in your little finger than most of these people have in their entire bodies. If they can't see your worth, that's their failing, not yours." The organ music began, filling the small church with the traditional wedding march. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized there was no more time for doubt. She either walked down that aisle now, or she ran away and broke the heart of the best man she had ever known. Maria gave her one final encouraging squeeze. "Remember what Papa said before he got too tired to speak much. He said James looks at you the way a man should look at the woman he loves, like you're the most precious thing in the world." Elena thought of her father, who had made the difficult journey to Wyoming despite his failing health, determined to see his daughter married. He was sitting in the front pew beside Mama, his thin frame wrapped in his best shirt, his eyes bright with pride and love. Taking a deep breath, Elena stepped into the church. The whispers died as she began her slow walk down the aisle, her simple white dress rustling softly with each step. She had made the dress herself, working by candlelight for weeks to create something beautiful yet modest. It wasn't fancy by society standards, but it was made with love and hope for the future. Halfway down the aisle, Elena's courage began to falter again. She could feel the weight of every gaze, could practically hear the thoughts running through people's minds. But then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who ran the boarding house, stood up suddenly and began to clap. Her weathered hands made a sharp sound in the hushed church, and her voice rang out clear and strong. About time someone in this town recognized a good woman when he sees one. Other voices joined in, some of the ranch hands, who had worked alongside Elena during cattle roundups, women from town who had seen her kindness at church socials, even some of the Mexican families who had moved to the area over the years. "She's got more sense than half the women in this valley. James is lucky to have her. Beautiful bride." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes as more and more people began to smile and nod their approval. Not everyone, the banker's wife, still sat stiff-backed and disapproving, but enough to remind Elena that she had allies in this community, people who had seen her character over the years and found it worthy of respect. By the time she reached the altar, Elena's confidence had returned. James stepped forward to take her hand, his face radiant with joy and pride. "You look beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I was scared," Elena admitted quietly. "I know," James replied, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. "But you're here now. You're brave enough to be here." The preacher, Reverend Mitchell, opened his worn Bible and smiled at the gathered congregation. He was an older man who had known the Caldwell family for decades, and he had agreed to perform the ceremony, despite some pressure from certain members of his congregation to refuse. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying easily through the small church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of James Robert Caldwell and Elena Maria Vasquez in holy matrimony." Elena barely heard the familiar words of the ceremony. She was lost in James's eyes, in the steady warmth of his hands holding hers, in the incredible reality that this moment was actually happening. But then the preacher said something that made her heart stop. Marriage is not just the joining of two people, but the blending of two families, two histories, two futures into one. Today, we celebrate not just the love between James and Elena, but the courage it takes to build bridges across the things that might divide us. Elena realized that Reverend Mitchell was addressing the elephant in the room directly, acknowledging the social barriers they were crossing, while framing it as something beautiful rather than scandalous. "If anyone here has reason why these two should not be wed, speak now, or forever hold your peace." The silence that followed felt eternal. Elena held her breath, half expecting someone to stand up and object. But the church remained quiet, except for the gentle sound of Papa's labored breathing and the distant call of a meadowlark outside the window. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride." James's smile was radiant as he leaned down to press his lips to Elena's. The kiss was gentle, respectful, appropriate for their public setting, but it carried the promise of all the kisses to come. The church erupted in applause and cheers, and Elena felt her heart soar with happiness. As she and James turned to face their community as husband and wife, she saw nothing but smiling faces and joy. They had done it. Against all odds, despite social barriers and whispered doubts, they had chosen love over fear. And in that moment, Elena knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The evening reception was winding down in the Caldwell barn, transformed for the occasion with white ribbons and wildflowers, when Elena noticed James standing alone by the open doors, staring out at the star-filled Wyoming sky with an expression she couldn't quite read. She excused herself from a conversation with some of the ranch hands' wives and walked over to him, her wedding dress rustling softly in the hay-scented air. The dancing had stopped, the musicians were packing their instruments, and most of the guests were beginning to make their way home. "Penny, for your thoughts," Elena said softly, slipping her hand into his. James turned to her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just thinking about how different everything is now. This morning I was a bachelor. Tonight I'm a married man with a wife and a whole new family to provide for." Elena felt a flutter of worry in her chest. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No," James said quickly, then paused. "Well, not about marrying you, never about that. But Elena, I keep thinking about what Mrs. Henderson said to you after the ceremony." Elena's stomach tightened as she remembered the banker's wife approaching her with a tight smile and false sweetness. She was just being herself. "She told you that marriage to me would be the hardest thing you'd ever do, that people would always question whether you belonged in our world, that our children would face difficulties because of your background." Elena had tried to push Mrs. Henderson's harsh words from her mind, but they had been echoing there all evening. The woman had spoken with the cruel precision of someone who knew exactly where to place her verbal knives. "James," Elena said carefully, "you can't let people like her poison our happiness." "I'm not worried about our happiness," James replied, turning to face her fully. "I'm worried about your pain." "Elena, I love you enough to want to protect you from everything, but I can't protect you from small-minded people who will always see your heritage before they see your heart." Elena studied her new husband's face in the moonlight, seeing the love and concern there, but also something else, a weight of responsibility that seemed to be settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. "What are you trying to say?" she asked quietly. James was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he struggled with words. Finally, he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew something small and white, a delicate lace glove that Elena recognized immediately. "This belonged to my sister Catherine," he said, holding it carefully between them. "Mother gave it to me this morning, said it was time it found a new purpose." Elena stared at the glove, confused by the sudden change in conversation. "James, I don't understand." "Catherine died when she was 16, James continued, his voice soft with memory. "She never got to marry, never got to have children, never got to see what kind of woman she might have become. But if she had lived, I know she would have been like you, kind, brave, willing to love someone even when the world made it difficult." James knelt suddenly on the barn floor, still holding the glove, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. "Elena, I know we're already married. I know we said our vows in front of God and the whole community, but I want to make you a different kind of promise now, just between us." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized what was happening. This wasn't about the social pressures they would face or the difficulties that lay ahead. This was James giving her something precious, something that belonged to his family's history. "I promise," James said, his voice steady and sure, "that I will never let you face their judgment alone. I promise that our children will know they come from two proud families, two strong traditions. I promise that when people question your worth, I will remind them and you that you are the most valuable thing in my world." Carefully, reverently, James took Elena's left hand and slipped the delicate glove over her fingers. The white lace looked ethereal against her skin, and Elena felt the weight of Catherine's memory, of family acceptance, of promises kept and futures embraced. "This glove represents something that transcends social barriers," James continued. "It represents family. It represents belonging. It represents the truth that love creates its own aristocracy." Instead of speaking, James lifted Elena's gloved hand to his lips and kissed it gently, the gesture as tender and meaningful as any words could be. In that simple act, Elena felt all her fears and doubts dissolve. She had spent so many years believing that her worth was determined by other people's opinions, by her circumstances, by how useful she could be. But looking into James's eyes as he kissed her hand, Elena finally understood that her value came from something much deeper, from her own heart, her own choices, her own capacity to love and be loved. "The glove is beautiful," Elena whispered, "but James, I need you to know something. I don't need symbols or promises to know that I belong with you. I know it here." She pressed her free hand to her heart. "We belong to each other, and that's stronger than anything people like Mrs. Henderson can say." James rose to his feet, his eyes bright with love and admiration. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "You didn't find me," Elena corrected with a smile. "We found each other, and we chose each other, every day, despite everything that tried to keep us apart." From across the barn, they heard Maria's voice calling Elena's name. The last of the guests were leaving, and it was time to help clean up, time to begin their new life as husband and wife. But first, Elena took one more moment to look around the barn where she had milked cows for 5 years as a housekeeper, and where she now stood as the bride at her own wedding reception. The transformation felt like magic, but Elena knew it was really something much more powerful. It was the result of courage, love, and the willingness to believe that sometimes the impossible could become possible. As they walked back toward their families, Elena's gloved hand still clasped in James's, she thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. From the scared girl who had arrived in Wyoming territory with nothing but a letter of recommendation, to the woman who had just married the love of her life surrounded by two families who had chosen to embrace each other. The white glove would remain with Elena for the rest of her life, A reminder of this night when she learned that true belonging doesn't come from conforming to other people's expectations. It comes from having the courage to claim your own happiness, to build your own family, to create your own definition of home. And in the Wyoming territory of 1,867, where the land was as vast and unforgiving as the hearts of its people could be generous, Elena Vasquez Caldwell discovered that the most revolutionary act of all was simply allowing herself to be loved completely, glove and all. The stars overhead seemed to shine a little brighter as they walked toward the house, toward their future, toward the beautiful uncertainty of a love that had conquered everything the world had thrown at it. Their story was just beginning.